Volume 1, Section 16 of The Life of Charlotte Bronte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary.
Read in French by Aldo.
And by Ruth Golding.
The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Volume 1, Section 16.
Imitation. Le 31 juillet 1842. Portrait de Pierre l'Ermite, Charlotte Bronte. De temps en temps, il paraît sur la terre des hommes destinés à être les instruments
Prédestiné. Pourquoi cette suppression?
de grands changements moraux ou politiques. Quelquefois c'est un conquérant, un Alexandre ou un Attila, qui passe comme un ouragan et purifie l'atmosphère morale comme l'orage purifie l'atmosphère physique. Quelquefois c'est un révolutionnaire, un Cromwell ou un Robespierre, qui fait expier par un roi
Les fautes et.
les vices de toute une dynastie. Quelquefois c'est un enthousiaste religieux, comme Mahomet ou Pierre l'Ermite, qui, avec le seul levier de la pensée, soulève des nations entières, les déracine et les transplante dans des climats nouveaux, peuplant l'Asie avec les habitants de l'Europe. Pierre l'Ermite était gentilhomme de Picardie, en France.
Inutile quand vous écrivez en français.
Pourquoi donc n'a-t-il passé sa vie comme les autres gentilshommes, ses contemporains, ont passé la leur, à table, à la chasse, dans son lit, sans s'inquiéter de Saladin ou de ses Sarrasins? N'est-ce pas parce qu'il y a dans certaines natures une ardeur
Un foyer d'activité.
indomptable qui ne leur permet pas de rester inactives, qui les force à se remuer afin d'exercer les facultés puissantes qui même en dormant sont prêtes, comme Samson, à briser les nœuds qui les retiennent.
Vous avez commencé à parler de Pierre. Vous êtes entré dans le sujet. Marchez au but.
Pierre prit la profession des armes. Si son ardeur avait été de cette espèce,
S'il n'avait eu que cette ardeur vulgaire,
qui provient d'une robuste santé, il aurait
su,
été un brave militaire et rien de plus. Mais son ardeur était celle de l'âme, sa flamme était pure et elle s'élevait vers le ciel. Sans doute,
il est vrai que
la jeunesse de Pierre était
fut
troublée par passions orageuses. Les natures puissantes sont extrêmes en tout. Elles ne connaissent la tiédeur ni dans le bien ni dans le mal. Pierre donc chercha d'abord avidement la gloire qui se flétrit et les plaisirs qui trompent, mais il fit bientôt la découverte
bientôt, il s'aperçut
que ce qu'il poursuivait n'était qu'une illusion à laquelle il ne pourrait jamais atteindre.
inutile quand vous avez dit illusion.
Il retourna donc sur ses pas. Il recommença le voyage de la vie, mais cette fois il évita le chemin spacieux qui mène à la perdition, et il prit le chemin étroit qui mène à la vie. Puisque
Comme
le trajet était long et difficile, il jeta la casque et les armes du soldat, et se vêtit de l'habit simple du moine. À la vie militaire succéda la vie monastique, car les extrêmes se touchent, et chez l'homme sincère, la sincérité du repentir amène,
nécessairement à la suite.
avec lui, la rigueur de la pénitence.
Voilà donc Pierre devenu moine.
Mais Pierre
Il,
avait en lui un principe qui l'empêchait de rester longtemps inactif. Ses idées, sur quel sujet qu'il soit,
que ce fut,
ne pouvaient pas être bornées. Il ne lui suffisait pas que lui-même fût religieux, que lui-même fût convaincu de la réalité du christianisme sikh. Il fallait que toute l'Europe, que toute l'Asie partageât sa conviction et professât la croyance de la croix. La piété,
fervente,
élevée par la génie, nourrie par la solitude, fit naître une espèce d'inspiration
et exalta son âme jusqu'à l'inspiration.
dans son âme, et lorsqu'il quitta sa cellule et reparut dans le monde, il portait comme Moïse l'empreinte de la divinité sur son front, et tous reconnurent en lui la véritable apôtre de la croix. Mahomet n'avait jamais remué les molles nations de l'Orient, comme alors Pierre remua les peuples austères de l'Occident. Il fallait que cette éloquence fût d'une force presque miraculeuse, qui pouvait persuader,
puisqu'elle persuadait,
aux rois de vendre leur royaume afin de procurer
pour avoir,
des armes et des soldats pour aider
à offrir,
à Pierre dans la guerre sainte qu'il voulait livrer aux infidèles. La puissance de Pierre
l'ermite,
n'était nullement une puissance physique, car la nature, ou pour mieux dire Dieu, est impartial dans la distribution de ses dons. Il accorde à l'un de ses enfants la grâce, la beauté, les perfections corporelles, à l'autre l'esprit, la grandeur morale. Pierre donc était un homme petit, d'une physionomie peu agréable, mais il avait ce courage, cette constance, cet enthousiasme, cette énergie de sentiment qui écrase toute opposition, et qui fait que la volonté d'un seul homme devient la loi de toute une nation. Pour se former une juste idée de l'influence qu'exerça cet homme sur les caractères,
choses,
et les idées de son temps, il faut se le représenter au milieu de l'armée des croisés, dans son double rôle de prophète et de guerrier. Le pauvre ermite, vêtu du pauvre,
de l'humble,
habit gris, est là plus puissant qu'un roi. Il est entouré d'une
de la,
multitude,
avide,
une multitude qui ne voit que lui, tandis qu'il, lui, il ne voit que le ciel. Ses yeux levés semblent dire « Je vois Dieu et les anges, et j'ai perdu de vue la terre. » Dans ce moment, le
messeux,
pauvre habit
froc,
gris est pour lui comme le manteau d'Elijah. Il l'enveloppe d'inspiration. Il
Pierre,
lit dans l'avenir. Il voit Jérusalem délivrée,
il voit,
le Saint-Sépulcre libre. Il voit le croissant argent est arraché du temple, et l'oriflamme et la croix rouge sont établis à sa place. Non seulement Pierre voit ces merveilles, mais il les fait voir à tous ceux qui l'entourent. Il ravive l'espérance et le courage dont
tous ces corps épuisés de fatigues et de privations.
la bataille ne sera livrée que demain, mais la victoire est décidée ce soir. Pierre a promis, et les croisés se fient à sa parole, comme les Israélites se fiaient à celle de Moïse et de Josué.
As a companion portrait to this, Emily chose to depict Harold on the eve of the Battle of Hastings. It appears to me that her devoir is superior to Charlotte's in power and in imagination, and fully equal to it in language; and that this, in both cases, considering how little practical knowledge of French they had when they arrived at Brussels in February, and that they wrote without the aid of dictionary or grammar, is unusual and remarkable. We shall see the progress Charlotte had made in ease and grace of style a year later. In the choice of subjects left to her selection, she frequently took characters and scenes from the Old Testament, with which all her writings show that she was especially familiar. The picturesqueness and colour, if I may so express it, the grandeur and breadth of its narrations impressed her deeply. To use Monsieur Heger's expression, Elle était nourrie de la Bible. After he had read Delavigne's poem on Joan of Arc, she chose the vision and death of Moses on Mount Nebo to write about. And in looking over this devoir, I was much struck with one or two of Monsieur Heger's remarks. After describing in a quiet and simple manner the circumstances under which Moses took leave of the Israelites, her imagination becomes warmed, and she launches out into a noble strain, depicting the glorious futurity of the chosen people, as, looking down upon the promised land, he sees their prosperity in prophetic vision. But, before reaching the middle of this glowing description, she interrupts herself to discuss for a moment the doubts that have been thrown on the miraculous relations in the Old Testament. Monsieur Heger remarks, "When you are writing, place your argument first in cool, prosaic language, but when you have thrown the reins on the neck of your imagination, do not pull her up to reason." Again, in the vision of Moses, he sees the maidens leading forth their flocks to the wells at eventide, and they are described as wearing flowery garlands. Here the writer is reminded of the necessity of preserving a certain verisimilitude. Moses might, from his elevation, see mountains and plains, groups of maidens and herds of cattle, but could hardly perceive the details of dress or the ornaments of the head. When they had made further progress, Monsieur Heger took up a more advanced plan, that of synthetical teaching. He would read to them various accounts of the same person or event, and make them notice the points of agreement and disagreement. Where they were different, he would make them seek the origin of that difference by causing them to examine well into the character and position of each separate writer, and how they would be likely to affect his conception of truth. For instance, take Cromwell. He would read Bossuet's description of him in the Oraison funèbre de la Reine d'Angleterre, and show how in this he was considered entirely from the religious point of view, as an instrument in the hands of God, preordained to his work. Then he would make them read Guizot, and see how, in this view, Cromwell was endowed with the utmost power of free will, but governed by no higher motive than that of expediency, while Carlyle regarded him as a character regulated by a strong and conscientious desire to do the will of the Lord. Then he would desire them to remember that the Royalist and Commonwealth men had each their different opinions of the great Protector, and from these conflicting characters he would require them to sift and collect the elements of truth and try to unite them into a perfect whole. This kind of exercise delighted Charlotte. It called into play her powers of analysis, which were extraordinary, and she very soon excelled in it. Wherever the Brontes could be national, they were so, with the same tenacity of attachment which made them suffer as they did whenever they left Haworth. They were Protestant to the backbone in other things beside their religion, but preeminently so in that. Touched as Charlotte was by the letter of St. Ignatius before alluded to, she claimed equal self-devotion, and from as high a motive, for some of the missionaries of the English Church sent out to toil and to perish on the poisonous African coast, and wrote as an imitation, Lettre d'un missionnaire Sierra Leone, Afrique. Something of her feeling, too, appears in the following letter. Brussels, 1842. I consider it doubtful whether I shall come home in September or not. Madame Heger has made a proposal for both me and Emily to stay another half-year, offering to dismiss her English master and take me as English teacher, also to employ Emily some part of each day in teaching music to a certain number of the pupils. For these services we are to be allowed to continue our studies in French and German, and to have board, etc., without paying for it. No salaries, however, are offered. The proposal is kind, and in a great selfish city like Brussels, and a great selfish school containing nearly 90 pupils, boarders and day pupils included, implies a degree of interest which demands gratitude in return. I am inclined to accept it. What think you? I don't deny I sometimes wish to be in England, or that I have brief attacks of homesickness, but on the whole I have borne a very valiant heart so far, and I have been happy in Brussels, because I have always been fully occupied with the employments that I like. Emily is making rapid progress in French, German, music, and drawing. Monsieur and Madame Heger begin to recognize the valuable parts of her character under her singularities. If the national character of the Belgians is to be measured by the character of most of the girls in this school, it is a character singularly cold, selfish, animal, and inferior. They are very mutinous and difficult for the teachers to manage, and their principles are rotten to the core. We avoid them, which is not difficult to do, as we have the brand of Protestantism and Anglicism upon us. People talk of the danger which Protestants expose themselves to in going to reside in Catholic countries, and thereby running the chance of changing their faith. My advice to all Protestants who are tempted to do anything so besotted as to turn Catholics is to walk over the sea onto the continent, to attend Mass sedulously for a time, to note well the mummeries thereof, also the idiotic, mercenary aspect of all the priests, and then, if they are still disposed to consider papistry in any other light than a most feeble, childish piece of humbug, let them turn papists at once, that's all. I consider Methodism, Quakerism, and the extremes of high and low churchism foolish, but Roman Catholicism beats them all. At the same time, allow me to tell you that there are some Catholics who are as good as any Christians can be to whom the Bible is a sealed book, and much better than many Protestants. When the Brontes first went to Brussels, it was with the intention of remaining there for 6 months, or until the Grandes Vacances began in September. The duties of the school were then suspended for 6 weeks or 2 months, and it seemed a desirable period for their return. But the proposal mentioned in the foregoing letter altered their plans. Besides, they were happy in the feeling that they were making progress in all the knowledge they had so long been yearning to acquire. They were happy, too, in possessing friends whose society had been for years congenial to them, and in occasional meetings with these they could have the inexpressible solace to residence in a foreign country, and peculiarly such to the Brontes, of talking over the intelligence received from their respective homes, referring to past or planning for future days. Mary and her sister, the bright, dancing, laughing Martha, were parlour boarders in an establishment just beyond the barriers of Brussels. Again, the cousins of these friends were resident in the town, and at their house Charlotte and Emily were always welcome, though their overpowering shyness prevented their more valuable qualities from being known, and generally kept them silent. They spent their weekly holiday with this family for many months, but at the end of the time Emily was as impenetrable to friendly advances as at the beginning, while Charlotte was too physically weak, as Mary has expressed it, to gather up her forces sufficiently to express any difference or opposition of opinion, and had, consequently, an assenting and deferential manner, strangely at variance with what they knew of her remarkable talents and decided character. At this house, the T.s and the Brontes could look forward to meeting each other pretty frequently. There was another English family where Charlotte soon became a welcome guest, and where, I suspect, she felt herself more at ease than either at Mrs. Jenkins or the friends whom I have first mentioned. An English physician, with a large family of daughters, went to reside at Brussels for the sake of their education. He placed them at Madame Heger's school in July 1842, not a month before the beginning of the Grandes Vacances on August 15th. In order to make the most of their time and become accustomed to the language, these English sisters went daily through the holidays to the pensionnat in the Rue d'Isabelle. 6 or 8 boarders remained besides the Miss Brontes. They were there during the whole time, never even having the break to their monotonous life, which, passing an occasional day with a friend, would have afforded them, but devoting themselves with indefatigable diligence to the different studies in which they were engaged. Their position in the school appeared, to these newcomers, analogous to what is often called that of a parlour boarder. They prepared their French, drawing, German, and literature for their various masters, and to these occupations Emily added that of music, in which she was somewhat of a proficient, so much so as to be qualified to give instruction in it to the 3 younger sisters of my informant. The school was divided into 3 classes. In the first were from 15 to 20 pupils. In the second, 60 was about the average number, all foreigners excepting the 2 Brontes and one other. In the third, there were from 20 to 30 pupils. The first and second classes occupied a long room divided by a wooden partition. In each division were 4 long ranges of desks, and at the end was the estrade or platform for the presiding instructor. On the last row, in the quietest corner, sat Charlotte and Emily, side by side, so deeply absorbed in their studies as to be insensible to any noise or movement around them. The school hours were from 9 to 12, the luncheon hour, when the boarders and half-boarders, perhaps 32 girls, went to the refectoire, a room with 2 long tables having an oil lamp suspended over each, to partake of bread and fruit. The externes, or morning pupils, who had brought their own refreshment with them, adjourning to eat it in the garden. From 1 to 2 there was fancy work, a pupil reading aloud some light literature in each room. From 2 to 4, lessons again. At 4, the externes left, and the remaining girls dined in the refectoire, Monsieur and Madame Heger presiding. From 5 to 6 there was recreation. From 6 to 7, preparation for lessons, and after that succeeded the lecture pieuse, Charlotte's nightmare. On rare occasions, Monsieur Heger himself would come in and substitute a book of different and more interesting kind. At 8 there was a slight meal of water and pistolet, the delicious little Brussels rolls, which was immediately followed by prayers, and then to bed. The principal bedroom was over the long classe, or schoolroom. There were 6 or 8 narrow beds on each side of the apartment, every one enveloped in its white draping curtain. A long drawer beneath each served for a wardrobe, and between each was a stand for ewer, basin, and looking-glass. The beds of the 2 Miss Brontes were at the extreme end of the room, almost as private and retired as if they had been in a separate apartment. During the hours of recreation, which were always spent in the garden, they invariably walked together, and generally kept a profound silence, Emily, though so much the taller, leaning on her sister. Charlotte would always answer, when spoken to, taking the lead in replying to any remark addressed to both. Emily rarely spoke to anyone. Charlotte's quiet, gentle manner never changed. She was never seen out of temper for a moment, and occasionally, when she herself had assumed the post of English teacher, and the impertinence or inattention of her pupils was most irritating, a slight increase of colour, a momentary sparkling of the eye, and more decided energy of manner were the only outward tokens she gave of being conscious of the annoyance to which she was subjected. But this dignified endurance of hers subdued her pupils in the long run far more than the voluble tirades of the other mistresses. My informant adds, "The effect of this manner was singular. I can speak from personal experience. I was at that time high-spirited and impetuous, not respecting the French mistresses. Yet, to my own astonishment, at one word from her, I was perfectly tractable, and so much so that at length Monsieur and Madame Heger invariably preferred all their wishes to me through her. The other pupils did not perhaps love her as I did, she was so quiet and silent, but all respected her." With the exception of that part which describes Charlotte's manner as English teacher, an office which she did not assume for some months later, all this description of the school life of the 2 Brontes refers to the commencement of the new scholastic year in October 1842, and the extracts I have given convey the first impression which the life at a foreign school, and the position of the 2 Miss Brontes therein, made upon an intelligent English girl of 16. I will make a quotation from Mary's letter referring to this time. The first part of her time at Brussels was not uninteresting. She spoke of new people and characters, and foreign ways of the pupils and teachers. She knew the hopes and prospects of the teachers, and mentioned one who was very anxious to marry, she was getting so old. She used to get her father or brother, I forget which, to be the bearer of letters to different single men, who she thought might be persuaded to do her the favour, saying that her only resource was to become a sister of charity if her present employment failed, and that she hated the idea. Charlotte naturally looked with curiosity to people of her own condition. This woman almost frightened her. She declares that there is nothing she can turn to, and laughs at the idea of delicacy, and she is only 10 years older than I am. I did not see the connection till she said, "Well, Polly, I should hate being a sister of charity. I suppose that would shock some people, but I should." I thought she would have as much feeling as a nurse as most people, and more than some. She said that she did not know how people could bear the constant pressure of misery, and never to change except to a new form of it. It would be impossible to keep one's natural feelings. I promised her a better destiny than to go begging anyone to marry her, or to lose her natural feelings as a sister of charity. She said, "My youth is leaving me. I can never do better than I have done, and I have done nothing yet." At such times she seemed to think that most human beings were destined, by the pressure of worldly interests, to lose one faculty and feeling after another, till they went dead altogether. I hope I shall be put in my grave as soon as I'm dead. I don't want to walk about so. Here we always differed. I thought the degradation of nature she feared was a consequence of poverty, and that she should give her attention to earning money. Sometimes she admitted this, but could find no means of earning money. At others she seemed afraid of letting her thoughts dwell on the subject, saying it brought on the worst palsy of all. Indeed, in her position, nothing less than entire constant absorption in petty money matters could have scraped together a provision. Of course artists and authors stood high with Charlotte, and the best thing after their works would have been their company. She used very inconsistently to rail at money and money-getting, and then wish she was able to visit all the large towns in Europe, see all the sights, and know all the celebrities. This was her notion of literary fame, a passport to the society of clever people. When she had become acquainted with the people and ways at Brussels, her life became monotonous, and she fell into the same hopeless state as at Miss W.'s, though in a less degree. I wrote to her, urging her to go home or elsewhere. She had got what she wanted, French, and there was at least novelty in a new place, if no improvement. That if she sank into deeper gloom she would soon not have energy to go, and she was too far from home for her friends to hear of her condition and order her home, as they had done from Miss W.'s. She wrote that I had done her a great service, and that she should certainly follow my advice, and was much obliged to me. I have often wondered at this letter. Though she patiently tolerated advice, she could always quietly put it aside, and do as she thought fit. More than once afterwards she mentioned the service I had done her. She sent me £10 to New Zealand on hearing some exaggerated accounts of my circumstances, and told me she hoped it would come in seasonably. It was a debt she owed me for the service I had done her. I should think £10 was a quarter of her income. The service was mentioned as an apology, but kindness was the real motive. The first break in this life of regular duties and employments came heavily and sadly. Martha, pretty, winning, mischievous, tricksome Martha, was taken ill suddenly at the Chateau de Kuckelberg. Her sister tended her with devoted love, but it was all in vain. In a few days she died. Charlotte's own short account of this event is as follows. Martha T.'s illness was unknown to me till the day before she died. I hastened to Kuckelberg the next morning, unconscious that she was in great danger, and was told that it was finished. She had died in the night. Mary was taken away to Bruxelles. I have seen Mary frequently since. She is in no ways crushed by the event, but while Martha was ill, she was to her more than a mother, more than a sister, watching, nursing, cherishing her so tenderly, so unweariedly. She appears calm and serious now, no bursts of violent emotion, no exaggeration of distress. I have seen Martha's grave, the place where her ashes lie in a foreign country. Who that has read Shirley does not remember the few lines, perhaps half a page, of sad recollection? He has no idea that little Jessie will die young. She is so gay and chattering and arch, original even now, passionate when provoked, but most affectionate if caressed, by turns gentle and rattling, exacting yet generous, fearless yet reliant on any who will help her. Jessie, with her little piquant face, engaging prattle and winning ways, is made to be a pet. Do you know this place? No, you never saw it, but you recognize the nature of these trees, this foliage, the cypress, the willow, the yew. Stone crosses like these are not unfamiliar to you, nor are these dim garlands of everlasting flowers. Here is the place, green sod and a grey marble headstone. Jessie sleeps below. She lived through an April day. Much loved was she, much loving. She often, in her brief life, shed tears. She had frequent sorrows. She smiled between, gladdening whatever saw her. Her death was tranquil and happy, in Rose's guardian arms. For Rose had been her stay and defence through many trials. The dying and the watching English girls were at that hour alone in a foreign country, and the soil of that country gave Jessie a grave. But, Jessie, I will write about you no more. This is an autumn evening, wet and wild. There is only one cloud in the sky, but it curtains it from pole to pole. The wind cannot rest. It hurries sobbing over hills of sullen outline, colourless with twilight and mist. Rain has beat all day on that church tower, Haworth. It rises dark from the stony enclosure of its graveyard. The nettles, the long grass, and the tombs all drip with wet. This evening reminds me too forcibly of another evening some years ago, a howling, rainy autumn evening too, when certain who had that day performed a pilgrimage to a grave new made in a heretic cemetery sat near a wood fire on the hearth of a foreign dwelling. They were merry and social, but they each knew that a gap never to be filled had been made in their circle. They knew they had lost something whose absence could never be quite atoned for, so long as they lived, and they knew that heavy falling rain was soaking into the wet earth which covered their lost darling, and that the sad, sighing gale was mourning above her buried head. The fire warmed them. Life and friendship yet blessed them, but Jessie lay cold, coffined, solitary, only the sod screening her from the storm. This was the first death that had occurred in the small circle of Charlotte's immediate and intimate friends since the loss of her two sisters long ago. She was still in the midst of her deep sympathy with Mary, when word came from home that her aunt, Miss Branwell, was ailing, was very ill. Emily and Charlotte immediately resolved to go home straight, and hastily packed up for England, doubtful whether they should ever return to Brussels or not, leaving all their relations with Monsieur and Madame Heger and the pensionnat, uprooted and uncertain of any future existence. Even before their departure, on the morning after they received the first intelligence of illness, when they were on the very point of starting, came a second letter, telling them of their aunt's death. It could not hasten their movements, for every arrangement had been made for speed. They sailed from Antwerp. They travelled night and day, and got home on a Tuesday morning. The funeral and all was over, and Mr. Bronte and Anne were sitting together in quiet grief for the loss of one who had done her part well in their household for nearly 20 years, and earned the regard and respect of many who never knew how much they should miss her till she was gone. The small property which she had accumulated by dint of personal frugality and self-denial was bequeathed to her nieces. Branwell, her darling, was to have had his share, but his reckless expenditure had distressed the good old lady, and his name was omitted in her will. When the first shock was over, the three sisters began to enjoy the full relish of meeting again, after the longest separation they had had in their lives. They had much to tell of the past, and much to settle for the future. Anne had been for some little time in a situation to which she was to return at the end of the Christmas holidays. For another year or so they were again to be all three apart, and after that the happy vision of being together and opening a school was to be realized. Of course they did not now look forward to settling at Burlington, or any other place which would take them away from their father, but the small sum which they each independently possessed would enable them to effect such alterations in the parsonage house at Haworth as would adapt it to the reception of pupils. Anne's plans for the interval were fixed. Emily quickly decided to be the daughter to remain at home. About Charlotte there was much deliberation and some discussion. Even in all the haste of their sudden departure from Brussels, Monsieur Heger had found time to write a letter of sympathy to Mr. Bronte on the loss which he had just sustained. A letter containing such a graceful appreciation of the daughters' characters, under the form of a tribute of respect to their father, that I should have been tempted to copy it even if there had not been a proposal made in it regarding Charlotte, which deserves a place in the record of her life.
Au révérend Monsieur Bronte, pasteur évangélique, etc., etc. Samedi, le 5 octobre. Monsieur, un événement bien triste décide mesdemoiselles vos filles à retourner brusquement en Angleterre. Ce départ, qui nous afflige beaucoup, a cependant ma complète approbation. Il est bien naturel qu'elles cherchent à vous consoler de ce que le ciel vient de vous ôter, en se serrant autour de vous pour mieux vous faire apprécier ce que le ciel vous a donné et ce qu'il vous laisse encore. J'espère que vous me pardonnerez, monsieur, de profiter de cette circonstance pour vous faire parvenir l'expression de mon respect. Je n'ai pas l'honneur de vous connaître personnellement, et cependant j'éprouve pour votre personne un sentiment de sincère vénération, car en jugeant un père de famille par ses enfants, on ne risque pas de se tromper, et sous ce rapport, l'éducation et les sentiments que nous avons trouvés dans mesdemoiselles vos filles n'ont pu que nous donner une très haute idée de votre mérite et de votre caractère. Vous apprendrez sans doute avec plaisir que vos enfants ont fait du progrès très remarquable dans toutes les branches de l'enseignement, et que ces progrès sont entièrement dus à leur amour pour le travail et à leur persévérance. Nous n'avons eu que bien peu à faire avec de pareils élèves. Leur avancement est votre œuvre bien plus que la nôtre. Nous n'avons pas eu à leur apprendre le prix du temps et de l'instruction. Elles avaient appris tout cela dans la maison paternelle, et nous n'avons eu, pour notre part, que le faible mérite de diriger leurs efforts et de fournir un aliment convenable à la louable activité que vos filles ont puisée dans votre exemple et dans vos leçons. Puissent les éloges mérités que nous donnons à vos enfants vous être de quelque consolation dans le malheur que vous afflige. C'est là notre espoir en vous écrivant, et ce sera, pour mesdemoiselles Charlotte et Emily, une douce et belle récompense de leurs travaux. En perdant nos deux chers élèves, nous ne devons pas vous cacher que nous éprouvons à la fois et du chagrin et de l'inquiétude. Nous sommes affligés parce que cette brusque séparation vient briser l'affection presque paternelle que nous leur avons vouée, et notre peine s'augmente à la vue de tant de travaux interrompus, de tant de choses bien commencées, et qui ne demandent que quelque temps encore pour être menés à bonne fin. Dans un an, chacune de vos demoiselles eût été entièrement prémunie contre les éventualités de l'avenir. Chacune d'elles acquérait à la fois et l'instruction et la science d'enseignement. Mademoiselle Emily allait apprendre le piano, recevoir les leçons du meilleur professeur que nous ayons en Belgique, et déjà elle avait elle-même de petites élèves. Elle perdait donc à la fois un reste d'ignorance et un reste plus gênant encore de timidité. Mademoiselle Charlotte commençait à donner des leçons en français, et d'acquérir cette assurance, cet aplomb si nécessaire dans l'enseignement. Encore un an tout au plus, et l'œuvre était achevée, et bien achevée. Alors nous aurions pu, si cela vous eût convenu, offrir à mesdemoiselles vos filles, ou du moins à l'une des deux, une position qui eût été dans ses goûts, et qui lui eût donné cette douce indépendance si difficile à trouver pour une jeune personne. Ce n'est pas, croyez-le bien, monsieur, ce n'est pas ici pour nous une question d'intérêt personnel, c'est une question d'affection. Vous me pardonnerez si nous vous parlons de vos enfants, si nous nous occupons de leur avenir, comme si elles faisaient partie de notre famille. Leurs qualités personnelles, leur bon vouloir, leur zèle extrême, sont les seules causes qui nous poussent à nous hasarder de la sorte. Nous savons, monsieur, que vous peserez plus mûrement et plus sagement que nous la conséquence qu'aurait pour l'avenir une interruption complète dans les études de vos deux filles. Vous déciderez ce qu'il faut faire, et vous nous pardonnerez notre franchise si vous daignez considérer que le motif qui nous fait agir est une affection bien désintéressée, et qui s'affligerait beaucoup de devoir déjà se résigner à n'être plus utile à vos chers enfants. Agréez, je vous prie, monsieur, l'expression respectueuse de mes sentiments de haute considération. C. et G.
There was so much truth as well as so much kindness in this letter, it was so obvious that a second year of instruction would be far more valuable than the first, that there was no long hesitation before it was decided that Charlotte should return to Brussels. Meanwhile, they enjoyed their Christmas altogether inexpressibly. Branwell was with them. That was always a pleasure at this time. Whatever might be his faults or even his vices, his sisters yet held him up as their family hope, as they trusted that he would some day be their family pride. They blinded themselves to the magnitude of the failings of which they were now and then told, by persuading themselves that such failings were common to all men of any strength of character. For till sad experience taught them better, they fell into the usual error of confounding strong passions with strong character. Charlotte's friend came over to see her, and she returned the visit. Her Brussels life must have seemed like a dream, so completely in this short space of time did she fall back into the old household ways, with more of household independence than she could ever have had during her aunt's lifetime. Winter though it was, the sisters took their accustomed walks on the snow-covered moors, or went off and down the long road to Keighley, for such books as had been added to the library there during their absence from England. End of section 16.